Thank you very much for being here, and all come and sit down. There's seats in the front row if you'd like to come along here. Everything that we've been hearing up to now, ladies and gentlemen, has just been a little bit of a warm-up for this session on rebalancing the world economy. And of course, there's a lot of similarities between some of the geopolitical and even geological questions that we've heard about. And in fact, even the vocabulary of upheavals in the world, politics, upheavals in world geology, certainly upheavals in the world oil industry, even the vocabulary is very similar to the vocabulary we sometimes use when things go wrong in economics. Words like tsunami, like earthquake, like tremors, like shivers, like shakes. You know, they're used all the time in the economic newspapers. And to help us guide ourselves through these issues, we've got three very, very distinguished people up here to talk to you. And I'm going to introduce two of them to begin with. The other person, you may have guessed, is here with us, but in cyberspace. And we know a lot about cyberspace, having heard that wonderful lecture last night. First of all, I'd like to introduce Gita Wirjawan, who is the chairman of the Investment Coordinating Board of Indonesia. Indonesia is the fourth most populous country in the world, about 230 million people. Also, I believe the state with the biggest number of people who are Islamic. So there's a real link to what we've just heard, the scintillating conversation we had earlier on. And of course, Indonesia is a worldwide economic giant, a member of the G20. And Gita is here really to tell us about Indonesia, but also to tell us more generally about how the famous emerging market economies are now making their voice heard on the world stage. Very pleased that you're here with us, Gita. And then my old friend and colleague, Martin Wolf, from the Financial Times, who is probably the most read economic commentator in the world, I would say. And he moves with the gravitas of a finance minister these days, or several finance ministers. And he always manages to combine a certain amount of gravitas with the ability of bringing out his columns regularly on time. Many finance ministers don't bring out their budgets on time, but Martin manages to produce his columns on time, and they're always incredibly well worth reading. So Martin can speak about anything, and he's here today to talk about the world economy and the rebalancing thereof. And these days, with politics and economics being in a state of flux, it's probably actually not a bad time to be the senior commentator of the Financial Times. It's probably not such a bad time either to be in charge of coordinating investments, particularly in a place like Indonesia. It could be that it's slightly more problematic if you're a politician, because politicians do have to act. And that, I believe, is the reason why the third member of our panel, Christine Lagarde, is not with us today in person. That is the bad news. The good news is that she's here with us in cyberspace. And she's recorded for us a message of 18 minutes, which just shows how much aptitude she has to put into words all the depth of feeling she feels for the St. Gallen Symposium. She's going to talk to us now for exactly 18 minutes through a video link. So we're very pleased to welcome Christine Lagarde. And for those of you at the back, particularly those of you who may be falling asleep, all you have to do is just look at the screen, and it's as though she's here. So please suspend disbelief. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you Christine Lagarde.
Monsieur le Président Erzinger, dear Philip, Chairman March, dear panelists, dear Martin, dear Gita, if I may, first of all, let me apologize humbly for only offering the background of Notre Dame in Paris, and poor me, through wires, electronic devices, that actually allow me to be with you on screen as opposed to physically with you. I offer my apologies, and I actually owe to St. Gall. I suppose this does not reduce the imbalances of gratitude that I have to you as an organization for having me yet again, although very notionally and virtually, for the second time. Not only do I apologize, but I wish I was there. And I honestly mean it, because it would give me a breath of fresh Swiss air to get away from quite a lot of work at the moment on the European scene and on the national scene. Turning to the topic of post-crisis rebalancing, I'd like to congratulate the students of St. Gall and the organization for having selected the topic. And one could actually wonder whether post-crisis is effectively relevant. And I would suggest that we actually assume that post-crisis is the relevant reference, that we have actually moved out and away from the heart of the crisis, from the peak of the crisis, from the worst of the crisis, times when employment was destroyed, time when mortgages were foreclosed, times when so much value has been destroyed around the world. Those were the 2 years, 2009, beginning of 2010, although 2010 marked the rebounds of the global economy. I used to say in political circles and at home that the crisis would be over and we would know that it is over when our economy would start creating jobs yet again. As many jobs were destroyed in 2009. In France, over 300,000 jobs were destroyed. The French economy has picked up and has begun to create net new jobs in the amount of 125,000 in 2010, and the forecast for 2011 is quite good, stronger than 2010. So I can legitimately turn to my constituents, to my base, and say, yes, we have pulled out of the crisis. Yes, by devising new agencies, new players, new schemes, reinventing the financing of the economy through massive stimulus packages, we've restored the situation. We've restored it, but have we rebalanced it? And is the goal to have the appropriate balance, to use a very quoted qualifier? Interesting question, actually, whether we need rebalancing and whether balancing is the right act to be had. I think it goes without saying that for decades before the crisis, or many years at least, we discussed about the vice of imbalances. Remember the double deficit, the twin deficit, the imbalances between, say, China and the United States, between European countries in the same Eurozone sometimes. And yet this did not, in and of itself, constitute a default situation, an event of crisis. No. But it was a very fertile ground from which the crisis was born and evolved and erupted on our domestic scene, without much notice, actually, in the autumn of 2008. But it was very fertile ground, actually, to have those imbalances in various corners of the world, and not much having been done to actually address the issue. In the period running from 1998 to 2007, no less than $2 trillion accumulated between surpluses and deficits of the G20 countries. I'm looking at my notes because I don't want to quote wrong numbers. It is actually the number of $2 trillion. Massive amount, massive imbalances between countries that deal with each other, trade with each other, invest into each other as a result of this incredible free trade movement and opening of markets that has taken place not only since the Doha round in 2001, but for quite a few years before. Although quite a few years not so long ago, we had exchange control, we had foreign direct investments review and controls. So we're not totally addicted to that free movement, that lack of financial repression, to again use a quoted word. As I said, global imbalances did not cause the global and the financial crisis, but it was fertile ground. And it is more the dissemination of risks fragmented, segmented, disseminated around the surface of the globe in financial markets that eventually caused, together with the complete lack of confidence that resulted from a major default, that actually caused this financial crisis that operated just like a meltdown, where finances just dried out from the surface of the globe in a matter of hours. Now, facing that reality and the destruction that followed, we all had to take exceptional measures, and we did. We did in the urgency of the matter. And as mentioned for France earlier, but that was the case for most countries, we put together massive stimulus packages to restore the economic and financial situation. We reactivated financial pipes that had dried out. And by so doing, we obviously created massive amounts of public debt. And from a situation where public debt was pretty much under control, navigating within the Eurozone, for instance, at a range of about 60% of GDP, we escalated that to amounts ranging from 80% to sometimes 160% of GDP, which is probably nothing compared with what Japan had accumulated. Not in terms of deficit so much, but in terms of debt. And here, obviously, I'm talking about debt. Debt to GDP increased massively as a result of those deficits that we had to create because we needed to inject public finance where there was no alternative finance available. And obviously, we are now back to a situation where our aim is to restore balances, or at least to reduce the imbalances that we lived with and that created that fertile ground fueled by lack of confidence, disseminated risks, insufficient or lack of regulation. As we're facing this post-crisis situation, clearly we need to address imbalances, the risk of worsening or improving the imbalances, and making sure that the other components of the crisis do not resume so that we can avoid the resurgence of yet another crisis of the same nature or another nature, because obviously history does not repeat itself so much. So what are we doing? Obviously, I'm going to talk about the G20 because France is president of the G20 until November. And if I may say, at this point in time in the year, we are moving from Cannes, festival time, to Cannes, G20 summit, from film to finance, and from entertainment to economy. And fortunately, although I was part of a very good film that I would encourage you to watch, Inside Job, I'm not in the business of film. I'm not in the business of entertainment. I'm more focused on finance and economy at the moment. Now let me identify for you two major tasks that we have assigned to ourselves for this French presidency of the G20. First of all, we want to reduce the imbalances that we've had, that we still have, and that could create, again, fertile ground for yet another crisis. What have we done for that? We've identified a project together, members of the G20, with the IMF, which is called the Framework for Solid, Sustainable and Balanced Growth. Yes, we believe that growth we need. Yes, we believe that it should be sustainable. And yes, we believe that it should be solid. Balance means that we accept, all of us, to address the imbalances and the causes for imbalances, the roots for imbalances, and are prepared to mitigate those imbalances, deal with them. We've been through two meetings already in 2011, one in Paris, one in Washington. During the first one, we were able together to identify what would be the economic indicators to determine the risk of imbalances. During the second meeting, we were able to agree on the guidelines that should be adopted to select those countries that need possible adjustment of the G20 countries. 7 were identified because a very tight net was applied to the criteria used for those. Those countries include obviously the usual suspects, all those countries that are considered systemic, and you can easily take the list of the top 7, you will find them. The next step, which is going to be the most difficult one actually, it's always the case, will be the step when we actually identify the remedies, the new policy mix, the special devices that need to be used over a period of time so that we can actually address the imbalances risks and try to redress them. That will be the job that will unfold and hopefully be completed at the Cannes G20 meeting in November. I'm working hard against that schedule and background, and I hope that all members of the G20 will be equally determined to actually turn that objective into performance and results. There is a second task that we've assigned to ourselves, which I think is critical as well when it comes to imbalances, because it actually deals also and touches on the first one, this framework for solid, sustainable and balanced growth. And that is the international monetary system. We have at the moment an international monetary system that is a bit skewed. You know, it dates back to the Bretton Woods arrangements. And in the meantime, obviously, the world has changed. Economic powers have emerged. Others have at least reduced in size and impact. But certainly the world has been a lot more open, and adjustments have taken place in a massive way, so that emerging powers are no longer developing countries, but some of their territories, some of their areas are as developed, if not more developed, than traditional developed economies. And simultaneously, the monetary system has not evolved much. We still have pretty much the same system with the IMF, obviously with more money available, with more flexible instruments, but still pretty much performing in the same fashion. So we need to gradually, step by step, try to address a situation where exchange rates, where capital flow movements, where liquidity needs are properly addressed in a fairly, not codified, but at least agreed way, concerted fashion, so that measures are not taken in a harsh and unpredictable way by countries that are suddenly flooded with capital flows, or that are suddenly dried out of such flows simply because capital goes in and out as a result of circumstances, interest rates, and what have you. We also need to agree on those financial safety nets that can be used by economies so that they don't feel the need to accumulate massive reserves, which clearly cause and participate in the creation of imbalances, as we discussed earlier. It's going to take time. It's not going to happen overnight, nor did the Bretton Woods arrangements and institutions were created overnight. But it's a path that we have decisively opened, and that we will continue to walk together with the other members of the G20, with support from the IMF, with support from the World Bank in some fashion, and with the hope that we turn those institutions and their tools and instruments, as well as the possible code of conducts, toolboxes, coherent conclusions, however you want to call them, into practical tools that we can use all together in a more multi-monetary environment than single currency, because the world has become multipolar. Those are two examples of how we need to make progress in rebalancing what was, is to a certain extent, and would continue to be imbalanced if we don't try to remedy the situation. Now, question, and I will conclude with that. why would we want to be so balanced? Are there benefits to this imbalances? Well, there are benefits actually. And it's obvious that some countries which are in the process of development, which are in the process of adjustment, need to have deficits, and that some, for instance, with massive reserves of oil have surpluses, obviously. And these particular factors, these particular circumstances need to be mitigated, need to be taken into account in the mutual assessment process that we conduct all together. My sense, though, is that we should continuously strive to rebalance, to reach that equilibrium, which is not necessarily balanced, where all of us benefit from the commonly discussed and coordinated policies, which will be identified jointly with due respect to what the requirements are in other countries, as much as we have concern and account for our domestic base. It is critical that we actually aspire to this global level at which economic policies can be determined with due account and due respect of what others need. And I think it is very much in the spirit of St. Gall to actually be accountable to others and take into account what others need and what others will suffer as a result of our own behavior and policy mix. Once again, please accept my apologies for not being with you at the table, in those chairs, looking at you in the eyes and enjoying as much as I've always enjoyed over the last 10 years, the proximity, the complicity, and the friendship of St. Gall. Thank you.
Well, I'm sure that applause will be heard beyond the pealing of the bells of Notre Dame, because it was really an absolutely consummate performance by the French finance minister. And I think everything that she says we will all heartfeltly concur with. It also, just the performance and the style and the resonance, this charm mixed with steel, I found really quite mesmeric. I could just carry on listening to that, I have to say. I really wished she was here, though, to look into my eyes and call me Chairman Marsh. It made you think that the way of producing Europe is really to have German policies being promulgated by French ministers. Meeting in an Italian palace with Swiss security. Now, that would be the way to put Europe on the map. Now, she's identified several different issues that we need to talk about. I'm going to ask Martin in a moment to talk first, because also I believe, Martin, you've got some slides that you can put up for us, which I hope will come up on the screen in a moment. But just let me just identify three things that she said, which I think are worthy of us discussing. Our subject today is power, and I think one of the imbalances is certainly in power, in the way that the world monetary and financial system works. You know, who has the power between the developed and the developing countries? That's something which she put her finger on by talking about the international monetary system. Another imbalance, of course, is growth, and the way that it is the developing countries who seem to be leaping away, with one or two exceptions, Germany doing very well, and France, according to the figures this morning, also performing pretty well in the 2011 so far. But there's an imbalance in growth, and there's also an imbalance in reserves. Christine Lagarde mentioned the imbalances between 1998 and 2008, $2 trillion. Well, in fact, the imbalances in terms of reserve accumulation are now getting worse again, because some countries seem to be still practicing a policy of undervaluation of their currencies. So there's imbalances in power, imbalances in growth, and certainly imbalances in financial firepower. Martin, I'm going to ask you just to elucidate these points, if I may.
Thank you very much. First of all, it's a great pleasure to be here again. I participated in a very exciting workshop on the Eurozone this morning, and I hope this will be almost as exciting, though we will miss Christine's participation. Fortunately, I've heard her speak on very similar lines at a conference in Paris just a month or two ago, so I had a pretty good idea of what she was likely to say. Now, if the technology works well, and of course it will because it's Switzerland, I can just introduce a few sort of background facts. Let me just state where I come from in this story. Probably about 8 or 9 years ago, I started writing about the very extraordinary pattern that had emerged, really starting after the Asian financial crisis in the late 1990s, in the global flows of capital and in the nature of those flows. And I became increasingly concerned about the risks, both domestic in the capital importing countries and global, associated with that. And I even started writing a book on this subject, which appeared in 2008, on these risks. I have to say that I did not foresee the scale of the crisis, nor its precise nature. But in my view, it is, as Christine Lagarde said, quite closely related to these phenomena. First of all, that's the first thing. And the second point is that in trying to get out from where we are now, the whole pattern of global demand, which is also the pattern of global capital flows, will have to change because, and is changing, but not enough, because it relied so extraordinarily heavily on huge and ultimately unsustainable deficits in a very small number of big countries, of which far and away the most important was the US. And that raises some very profound questions about risk, global monetary systems, and all that, which was actually raised by Christine. I'm not going to be able to go into those in detail in these opening remarks, but I hope that they will, we will come out in our discussion. Okay, the first point is that quite different, utterly different from the period of what sometimes called the first globalization, the globalization of the late 19th and early 20th century. Capital has been flowing from poor countries to rich countries, not from rich countries to poor countries, net. That's not true for foreign direct investment, but overall there's been a massive flow from poor countries to rich countries. And most of that, or an enormous portion of this, is not the result of some natural market process, but on the contrary, a very deliberate policy, quite understandable in some ways, of taking the capital inflows plus maintained current account surpluses through foreign currency intervention and recycling this whole lot into enormous official capital outflows. Our capital flow picture in the world is dominated by states, not by markets. And that was motivated by three main forces that were important to the countries that made this, these interventions. First, a profound desire to achieve insurance. And that insurance, it was thought, will be achieved by accumulating enormous claims, principally in government liabilities of the United States. That became the principal insurance medium for the world system, and that is a reinforcement of the dollar's domination in that period, as Christine Lagarde mentioned. Second, there was a very powerful desire to maintain, or if not maintain, to go back to export-led growth, which had been seen to be the most successful route of development and which many people, particularly in Asia, concluded had been abandoned stupidly before the crisis. And finally, since China was itself the biggest intervener and had the most powerful competitive position, people wanted to avoid losing their competitive positions. And the tragedy is this colossal flow of capital, and we will see in a minute how big, was essentially wasted. The biggest act of capital destruction imaginable. It was poured particularly into the US, also to countries like the UK, directly into Spain, where it went into building houses that it turned out nobody wanted and destroying the financial system, which wasn't particularly helpful either. So that's what we ended up with at the end of this process, a colossal amount of bad debt. This is what the global picture roughly looked like. So we started at the beginning of the last decade with essentially no significant net flow of capital across the world. And the ratio of the net flow of capital across the world to world GDP increased sevenfold in 6 or 7 years. And if you look at the components, there are essentially three components. East Asian exporting countries, of which China was the overwhelming dominant one. Two very big developed countries, surplus countries, Germany and Japan, and the oil exporters, and 70% of this net capital flow went into one country, the US, the richest in the world. And I can assure you that any economist thinking about how the globalized financial system would operate nobody expected this. It's a really extraordinary phenomenon. We then ended up with a huge crisis, a sudden contraction, which was associated with the destruction of demand, but the IMF expects this to reverse and to remain very large for the future. And the second point, as I said, I just want to give you the picture, is that the dominant form of this capital flow was a massive official flow. Here I just look at foreign currency reserves. There's also the sovereign wealth funds, which would add another 3 or 4 trillion to this. Between the end of the last century and today, global foreign currency reserves, which are official capital outflows, have risen from $1.5 trillion to $9 trillion. There's been, as Christine mentioned, $2 trillion increase just to the end of the crisis. Roughly a third of these reserves, a little bit more, belong to China, but there are many other emerging countries that have done this. This is, as I've liked to joke, given who the recipient is, the biggest foreign aid program in world history. And it's from, as I said, poor countries to rich countries. Now, the question is what's going to happen now? And this is where we are observing a really fascinating picture, and it relates to all this discussion of currency wars and all the issue around that. Essentially, the private sector of the world, which is the red column in this chart, is trying to put capital net into the emerging world, with the flows estimated by the Institute for International Finance running at about $1 trillion a year. In addition, the emerging countries continue to run quite large current account surpluses, and this is being offset partly by private capital outflow from the emerging world, but above all by this continued massive reserve accumulation. Now, the point about this is this pattern is very uneven among emerging countries. Some are much better able to manage currency intervention than others. Those that are not able to manage currency intervention because it creates very considerable instability have basically decided to let their currency go, so they lose competitiveness, and they're very concerned about that. That's what the Brazilian finance minister meant when he talked about currency wars. That's exactly what he meant. And at the same time, those countries that are intervening are worried about the inflationary consequences of this. So we have a very profound post-crisis maladjustment emerging as private money flows out of the developed countries trying to get into the emerging countries. There's no doubt this is partly related to the very low interest rates in the developed world, which are going to continue. There are many people who think it's all related to quantitative easing, and I'm prepared to assert with absolute confidence, which you will no doubt not accept, that that is complete nonsense. Now, but what is certainly true is that we are in a long-run dollar bear market. You can see this very long-run dollar bear market, and that's a reflection of the desire, in my view, of the world to diversify out of dollar claims, the private sector, into other claims. That's what is being adjusted here. There was a brief blip up during the crisis, and it is now reversing. So it is no doubt that dollar weakness creates lots of problems for the emerging world. Unfortunately, they're probably going to have to live with it. So what I think where we are now, I just want to conclude this, is the very uneven unwinding of the imbalances, which I've talked about, partial and unevening unwinding of the imbalances, is involving very significant economic dangers. The currency war issue I've already mentioned. There is the problem of bubbles in countries that are intervening, and there's the associated problem of inflation. So agreeing on a way of rebalancing the world economy that manages those concerns is, I think, a central issue if we're going to have a stable recovery. But we cannot avoid accelerated external adjustment, because the countries that have these huge fiscal deficits have to eliminate them. And if they're going to eliminate these fiscal deficits while they continue to have higher savings than before, they're going to have to eliminate their current account deficits, and that means global adjustment. There is just no way out of this, and one way or another it's going to happen. And I see this just as a question of how it happens. It could be smooth, or it could be very, very disruptive. disruptive. And as long as we have this threat overhanging us, there is some danger of further significant financial and macroeconomic shocks. Thank you very much.
No, thank you very much, Martin, for cheering us up very nicely. And you've spoken rightly, I think, about the issue of financial and monetary imbalances, and it's very right that we do that, and that follows on very much from what Christine Lagarde said. And I think it's also, I'd like us all in the course of the discussion to talk a little bit about the international monetary system and also about the euro, because that's something which hasn't been talked about. And in this country, too, it's of significance because the Swiss National Bank has been intervening very steadily to try to damp the appreciation. And, of course, the Swiss National Bank doesn't like holding euros, doesn't like holding dollars. And I don't know if you're aware that the Swiss National Bank has become the first European central bank of a developed kind to actually announce that it's now buying Asian currencies, small amounts, but it's got hold of some Singaporean dollars. And this is part of this, as you rightly say, Martin, move to a multipolar world. I'd like now with Gita to get onto the power issue. To put it bluntly, the reason why the G20 was established in its newer form, I would have thought, with the politicians and not just the central bank governors and the finance ministers, was, I would have thought, to give the developing or the emerging world more clout. I mean, has it got this? Do you want this clout? I mean, maybe a poison chalice. And also, one notices that a lot of the G20 process does seem to be running out of steam. I thought the whole point about the G20 process was to not have too many Europeans turning up. But it seems there's even more Europeans than ever before turning up at these meetings. I mean, the Italians are still there, and then I think the Spanish turn up, and the Dutch is almost as many as when you have a European Council meeting. You know, is the G20, from your perspective, your very large country, part of the G20, is it doing its job properly? And also, can you tell us a little bit about how you see, how you perceive this issue of power, you know, de facto and de jure power by the emerging world in the monetary and financial councils internationally?
Thanks, David. First of all, I want to thank the St. Gallen Symposium and Philip, of course, for allowing me to be here. If anybody would have thought that the Pakistanis are underrepresented, try being Indonesian. I'm probably the first Indonesian to be asked to speak at such a beautiful and prestigious event. I want to basically put the answer in the context of how we have participated at some of the G20 meetings ever since we became member, and put that in the context of what has happened in recent few months or many months. If we would have gone back to the medio or mid part of last year, that's when, you know, the QE, quantitative easing money, started taking place. And if you would have seen the stock markets in the latter part of last year, particularly those in the emerging markets, I think they experienced a pretty significant spike by virtue of the infusion of liquidity into their markets. But go back 3 months, early part of this year, much of that, if not most of that, got sucked back to the US. And this has, I think, been very good for the US economy in terms of buoying demand and domestic demand. And that's going to be good for the US economy, at least for the next couple of years, and could be good for somebody who's trying to get reelected next year. But what happens is this buoyancy of demand surely will affect commodities prices. And commodities prices going up certainly will be good for anybody that produces commodities, and certainly Indonesia is within that domain. But it's going to be very challenging because here we're sitting in the middle of Europe, knowing that quite a number of the European countries would have to get on their austerity measures. And Christine aptly pointed out some of the challenges from a G20 standpoint. I just don't know how the Americans and the Europeans are going to have an easy conversation at the rate that the Americans have a very much vested interest in, you know, a continuation of the buoyancy of domestic demand, and that's going to affect prices. And the Europeans, at the same time, they're going to have to tighten their belt. So that's strictly within the context of just the Europeans and the US in the upcoming G20 in November. Now, put into the equation the Asian components, and that's mainly China, India, and Indonesia. I think China and India are big parts of Asia, and Indonesia is trying to be a much more relevant part than before, where we have not been known much as a force. From an experience standpoint, certainly there hasn't been much of an impact that we could have made on the G20 conversations. And I think the level of difficulty will be even higher just by virtue of the earlier complications that would be there between the Americans and the Europeans. Now, I want to just peel the onion a little bit more on rebalancing, okay? Christine Martin aptly pointed out about what happened in the Asian financial crisis in 1997. You probably don't know this, but we had it really, really tough in 97, 98. One tries to imagine, a currency going from 2,000 rupees per dollar to 17,000 rupees per dollar in a matter of 2 to 3 months. Interest rates going out from 12% to 75%. And almost all of our foreign exchange reserve getting wiped out. And from a political standpoint, most of us just didn't know what the hell was happening. And if anybody would have asked me as to whether or not Indonesia was going to balkanize or disintegrate in 98, there's a damn good chance I would have agreed. But shockingly, Indonesia has come out of the hole. Now we're, I think, can gloat a little bit about some of our fiscal, monetary, and political achievements. Democratization has taken place in such a nice way. There is no apparent centrifugal force that could seem to rip the country apart from within. Fiscally, we're looking at a debt to GDP ratio of 26%, which is going to be declining, to about 21% in the next 3 years. I think we can be proud somewhat of that, especially when we look at the Japanese and some of the European countries who I think are struggling. Monetarily also, we have done a pretty damn good job. We have not had to raise our policy rate by more than once in the last 16, 17 months, while China and India had to do that 7 or 8 times. But I think the problem with Indonesia is the lack of education. So looking back 11 years, I think we have rebalanced ourselves. And if you put this global context in front of you, I think it's a question of the extent to which the Europeans will be able to tighten their belts. But there is always a political variable in that equation. And I think if you take a 2 to 3 year view of the United States, I think they will be able to somewhat recover and enjoy somewhat of a, 3.5% to 4% economic growth rate this year. But if one tries to take a 10 to 15 year view of the US, it may be manageable for them to rebalance their fiscal situation. It may be manageable for the Europeans to rebalance their fiscal situations. But I think Asia in itself also has challenges to make sure that the world stays as a much more rebalanced, especially if you take into account China. China, from a demographic standpoint, it will be aging in a few years' time. India and Indonesia are luckier because we are reproductive societies. And we like to reproduce in that, yeah, and...
the 3 times starts as equal.
60% of our population are younger than 39 years old, and I can allude to Mr. Aidi this morning, who was making the observation about Middle Eastern people being so young. And we're going to maintain this demographic profile for the next 15 years. So if we get our act together in terms of infusing software into the people, I think we'll be able to maintain and sustain the rebalance posture.
No, well, thank you.
Thanks.
Well, I think it's not just Indonesia, but the whole of Asia can take credit from the fact that you have recovered from the 1997, 1998 dislocations, and Asia does seem to have done its homework better than the Europeans. Just before passing on to Martin and to ask about the international monetary system, could I just ask you one very quick question, Gita? You seem to be rather worried about Europe. I know you're coordinating investments for Indonesia, but let's say you were putting money abroad. Would you put money into Europe at the moment, given the state of the fragmentation, you might say, of the economies? Just very quick answer, compared with America, say.
I think generally I would certainly buy a call option on Europe, and it has fantastic innovative capabilities, and I do think there are bright spots happening, well, Germany being one of them. And I do believe that there's going to be a political convergence which would entail fiscal reconfiguration. It may not take 2 days, it may take longer, but I think that's certainly worth buying a call option.
Well, I know you've got a lot of islands in Indonesia, but there will be 1 or 2 islands, I think, in the southern part of Europe, which could be coming onto the market in the next few years. Martin, Christine Lagarde mentioned the question of the international monetary system. No, she mentioned can. Now, of course, the French are very theatrical, but of course, if you'd really wanted to put on a conference which would rival Bretton Woods, you wouldn't choose can, because it doesn't sound good. You can't say, well, we've invented the can system. It sounds like something out of the Can-Can Club or something like that. You'd choose somewhere like Montpellier. So I don't think that this is going to rival Bretton Woods, but do you take it seriously, what President Sarkozy, in a very, I think, intellectually and politically honest way, he's saying that this huge imbalance between the dollar still making up such a large percentage of world reserves, it just cannot be sustainable. The euro is there as well as number 2. He wants to reform the system. The Chinese say they want to reform the system. Is the system reformable?
The position of our newspaper, which of course must be correct, is that Mr. Sarkozy, despite the eloquent presentation of his ideas by Christine Lagarde, is wasting his time. And since this is a panel session, one has to be a little bit honest about these things. But at the very least, let's start up by defining what the problem is. One view of the problem is that, unfortunately, the world, for some reason that nobody fully understands, continues to hold far more dollars than is reasonable. You're right, reserved about 2/3, something like that, depends on the value of the dollars, surely well below that at the moment, is held in dollars, and only, I think, 25% in euros, and that leaves you with about 10% or so in other currencies, of which the yen is the most important. And that seems rather anomalous because the Eurozone and the US are roughly the same size. Now, this really is a market decision. And the market, of course, is governments. The governments are the buyers, but they are making an assessment of what they think is going to be the most reliable asset for the future. And they're looking both at the likely durability of the currency and the sorts of assets that they can purchase and how attractive they are. It's pretty obvious, I think, that in terms of both durability of the entity and the range and liquidity, the depth and liquidity of the market, and its historic benefit, the advantage of incumbency, the dollar has an enormous advantage. So it's just going to take. There's a very good book by Barry Eichengreen out just on this. There will be a shift if the euro survives, which I expect it to do, of course, but it will probably take 20, 30 years, and it really doesn't matter. This is not a giant world issue, although it is, of course, a noble cause for the French government, and it will continue to be in many incarnations over the years. Interestingly, I think I have a strong impression that other important countries in Europe don't really want this to happen very much at all because they fear the consequences for the strength of the euro. I'm not at all sure that Germany really wants the euro to become as important as the dollar. It creates some big problems in terms of value. That's one issue. There's a completely different issue, which is, I think, the core issue, which is the monetary system is ultimately a mechanism of adjustment. That's really what economists are interested in. And here we have two monetary systems operating side by side. And that's really what I was talking about. We have a floating rate system among the developed countries, and we have a fixed rate system between very important developing countries, quasi-fixed, and the core country, the dollar. And that creates all the adjustment process. All the adjustment process is shifted onto floating rate countries. And that's what this whole instability problem is. Now, that is a genuine problem. Unfortunately, it's a problem that can only be fixed by persuading countries that they now have large enough reserves and they have wasted enough in purchasing these assets. And that is primarily a debate between everybody else in the world. Let's be quite clear, everybody else in the world and China. The problem is that China is more powerful than everybody else in the world on this topic, and therefore this is also a waste of time. So the conclusion is it's an incredibly interesting, fascinating, intellectually intriguing discussion, but it's a waste of time.
Yes. Well, ladies and gentlemen, you've heard from one of the most eminent commentators in the world the news that the world's best-known business newspaper simply wastes your time every day because it writes a great deal about these things. And it seems to sell newspapers, but it seems to go very well.
We report what policymakers talk about, however bright or not bright it may be.
But if I may just correct you, there's actually one small statistic that I think, with respect, you got wrong. I think actually sterling is now more important than the yen in terms of world monetary reserves, which is strange but true, that the diversification has gone so far that even sterling has almost coming...
Have to check that.
We'll have to check. Well, there's a pint of beer on this,
I don't
Martin.
always agree with you.
No, well, sometimes I disagree with you. But anyway, just going back to this issue, Gita, about the inflows. Martin made the point about the private sector of the world putting money into the emerging markets, partly because they do think that that peg, that fixed rate system which Martin was talking about, will break. There's a lot of speculative money going into the renminbi on the assumption that sooner or later the Chinese will do exactly what the Germans did in the end of the 1950s and the early 1960s, i.e. Let the currency appreciate in the interest of quelling inflation. And there seems to be quite a lot of money piling up in different countries to break those pegs, which of course could be very disruptive and very inflationary. We've had then capital controls now being reintroduced. The IMF got it totally wrong on capital controls, I think, during the Asian crisis. And only recently have we seen some signs of greater humility by the IMF. All this is leading up to the idea of whether the emerging markets should have a greater role in the world's monetary policeman of the International Monetary Fund. You know, can you get back to this power issue about, you know, trying to get a handle on this question of, you seem to have de facto financial power because you've got the reserves, the money is flowing in your direction. Do you have, or indeed, do you want to have de jure international financial power?
Well, let's talk about China. I think it depends on the degree to which China will be able to move the pendulum from one end to the other. And China, from a structural standpoint, is different from that of India and Indonesia. India and Indonesia consume a lot, just like the Americans. You know, about 60 to 70% of their economies are based on domestic consumption, whereas China is the other way around. So China's challenge going forward is to try to move their pendulum from an investment export-centric economy to a consumption-centric economy. But it may sound counterintuitive. I was sharing this with Martin earlier. You know, if you're already eating 3 bowls of rice, it's easier to go down to 2 bowls of rice a day, as opposed to going up to 6 bowls of rice a day. So if you expect China to increase domestic demand in a relatively short period of time, that ain't going to happen. It will take many, many years for that to happen. So I think it will, you know, as much as China sits on top of $3 trillion worth of reserves, if they can't get their act together in moving the pendulum from one end to the other at a fast enough pace, it will make the investment thesis less attractive than it has ever been the past 10, 20 years. Indonesia and India, I think, have a slightly less difficult problem. If we're already eating 3 bowls of rice, it's definitely a lot easier to eat 2 bowls of rice. It may sound counterintuitive, but I've tried it. You can try it. It's how we can move from 30%, you know, export orientation to perhaps 40, 50% or even more. We don't know where the equilibrium is. But I think until then, Indonesia and India will go through a pretty significant repricing of risks, and that will serve as a pretty attractive, investment thesis. And I think more and more money will continue flowing.
And in fact, you are doing this through increasing trade integration, aren't you, within
Yes.
the ASEAN bloc, which is a very sensible way of doing it, I would say. I'd like us to talk about the euro just for a moment, because, Martin, you've given the framework, because you said that the world is split up into fixed rates and floating rate blocks. But, of course, within the euro, it's like a Russian doll, isn't it? Like a mystery wrapped up in an enigma. We've got a floating rate system with a fixed rate component. We've abolished currencies in Europe. We hated those floating currencies so much we just got rid of them. We've not fixed currencies, we've got rid of them. So, as people like you often say, we can't go back to what we used to have. On the other hand, you've said yourself that you think the whole thing is heading for the rocks, and you've recently declared in a statement of great significance that Greece will have to restructure its debts, which I think most people on the private markets do think. Now, given the fact that we're all in a worldwide competition for funds, and there are people from other rich emerging countries who are thinking about investment in Europe, it doesn't do much good for our image, shall we say, in India or China or Indonesia when we have this enormous crisis. I know it wouldn't sell newspapers if this crisis suddenly came to an end, but can you just sketch out how you think the euro crisis will, if not come to an end, at least come to some sort of plateau?
How many hours do we have?
Well, people are very patient in Switzerland.
Okay, no, I'll try and... first of all, the big point is the world is, I'm sure, very happy to put money into those parts of Europe that don't need it. The problem effectively is there are some parts of the European economy that after the crisis are no longer places into which foreign capital is going, either into the public sector or the private sector, so they are going through an enormous adjustment. If you left it entirely to the market, there would have just been a series of bankruptcies, sovereign and private. That's what would have happened. In fact, they would have looked rather like Indonesia after '97. And Gita described exactly what happened in Indonesia, and that's what would have happened to countries all around Europe. And since they didn't have a currency to adjust, it would have been a bigger bankruptcy. The decision of the European governments is that must be prevented. And so long as the problem is limited to the main countries we know about, it can be prevented forever. So what I argued in my column, it's very, very straightforward, is there is a simple binary choice in a sense. You allow defaults to happen, or you finance these countries for the indefinite future, which, as I said, is not forever, but it could be for a very long time. I suspect, since you asked the question what I think will happen, I suspect the European governments will decide to finance them forever. And therefore we are going to have a new package, followed by a new package, followed by a new package, and perhaps people will even get used to it. On the other hand, of course, that's a politically difficult process, and maybe at some point it will break. But it's clear, my guess will be, if we look at the newspaper in a day or two or three, that after Christine Lagarde's meetings and other such meetings, we will find a new package, and the money is rolled over. Maybe there's a little bit of maturity extension for the private sector, but there will be no significant haircuts. That may be wrong, but that's my guess. And the reason for that is as soon as there are significant haircuts for one country, there is terror that it will occur for a whole range of countries, and it worsens the panic. So I think that's where you're stuck. Now, what's the underlying problem, apart from all the mistakes of the past, is the underlying problem is exactly what happens in a fixed rate system when you have massive competitive disequilibria. There has to be an alternative adjustment mechanism, and the adjustment mechanism in a fixed currency system is depression. That's how you adjust, and that's what's going to happen.
Well, it's interesting that we've been speaking about current account imbalances, but of course within Europe there's many countries, Switzerland is one of them, but Germany and Netherlands, and there's about 8 or 9 countries that have had very solid current account surpluses now for 8 or 9 years. So we've got the same sort of disequilibria that we've been speaking about on the world scale in the European scale.
Why Switzerland has such an impressively strong currency, and why they can't complain about its rising, in my humble opinion.
Well, also, if what you say...
the market at work.
I mean, if what you say is right, Martin, it could well be that the Germans in particular are going to be asked to put their hands in their pocket really for the foreseeable future. That would explain why a lot more well-heeled Germans will be finding it very attractive to come and live down here, I think, in coming years. This will be a great boost to the supply side of the Swiss economy and will also bring tremendously increased amounts of German assets into Switzerland. But we're supposed to be sitting here, Gita, learning from each other. And as I said before, and I think we all agree, Asia did do its homework very well. We're perhaps not very good at learning from Asia, we Europeans. You know, we still think we're the center of the world, which we're clearly not. I want to get back to this issue, which you've been very modestly skirting around. Or maybe it's just that power doesn't interest you. It could be that. But is there anything at all that you can learn from Europe, either positive or negative, shall we say, over the last 20 years? Because I think we can learn a lot from Asia, and maybe we should be looking there more. But what can you, honestly speaking, learn from us? Apart from the usual jokes about cuckoo clocks.
This could be a very short answer.
And I'm putting you on the spot now.
Look, I can speak as an Indonesian, okay? How Indonesia could learn from Europe. I think Europe has tremendous innovative educational capacity and infrastructure. And it has gone through phases of manufacturing, prowess or supremacies that perhaps the Japanese, the Koreans, and the Chinese have learned, and that's certainly something that we can learn from Indonesia. I want to do a bit of promotion for Indonesia here.
That's allowed.
We have only produced 14,000 PhDs. There is only 14,000 Indonesian PhDs kicking and alive.
There's that many coming out of China every week, I guess.
China has 500,000. Give and take, India has 500,000, and India is producing 1 million engineers and 500,000 doctors per year. We don't do that kind of a scale. And if we don't do that, I think we're going to be just exporting coal, oil, gas, copper, gold, cocoa, and palm oil.
It's not bad to be going on with, is it? But maybe a little bit more for what you do after lunch.
Not bad, but I don't want my kids to be stupid.
Yeah.
I want my kids to be able to, hopefully in the next 10 to 20 years, some Steve Jobs would be born out of Borneo or Papua or whatever. That's really the aspiration for some of the young Indonesians who have decided to join the government and take a massive pay cut. You
count yourself as one of these young Indonesians.
That is happening in Indonesia, and I think we're learning not just from the Europeans, but we're learning from the Indians and the Japanese and the Koreans and the Chinese, and that would be my observation.
Okay, well, thank you. I'm going to open this up now to the floor. There's lots of you here. I'm sure a lot of you are going to be helping Gita in coming years with all his education program. Somebody, yes, please, gentlemen over here. I can't see you. You can see me. Stand up, say who you are, speak loudly, and don't say very much, but say something interesting.
Okay, I'll do my best. My name's Hugh. I'm from the University of Queensland in Australia. I've just got a question about the G20. After the Japanese earthquake, the G7 acted in a matter of days to counteract the rising yen. It seems it will be some time before the G20 can take a similarly interventionist role. Could you comment on what it's like as a non-G7 country, sorry, it's for Mr. Wirjawan, as a non-G7 country in activating a genuine G7 to G20 power shift? Because for such an informal institution, it seems it's quite hard to observe from the outside the processes inside the G20.
Thank you. That's a bit my question, isn't it? Just putting it again in a slightly more erudite way. Yeah. Is there somebody else, just while you're thinking about this, any other? Please take any microphone. I can't see you, but you can see me. Yes, as a lady or gentleman, can't even see who you are, but you look a very attractive specimen of humanity, whoever you are. Please, please say your question.
Yeah, thank you very much for such a great panel discussion. I'm from New Zealand, and I'm a PhD student in engineering. My question to you is something that I've asked repeatedly over this symposium, and I would like to ask this question once again. Do you think following the economic crisis, there has been a major shift, or there is happening a major shift in the type of investment from the consumer capitalistic architecture, which I believe is kind of the crux of the economic crisis, to areas that'll bring long-term, that'll have long-term returns, like let's say investing in technologies or developing vaccines for AIDS or malaria
You're more than simply commodities and resources, you mean?
Exactly,
yeah.
and like clean drinking water or immigration policy, etc. Do you think there happening a major shift in.
Okay, that's an
investment.
excellent point, which I think ties in with the spirit of St. Gallen. One
Thank
more
you very
question,
much.
please. Yes, please. This gentleman down here in the second row, third row. Here we are. Yeah, could you bring a microphone down here, please? Yes. Gentleman with a bit of designer stubble, I think, or maybe it's just my glasses missed it up. Yeah.
Hello. My question is to the Honest Guardian.
The Honest Guardian?
Self-defined, right?
Yeah. I thought it was Martin. No.
Martin. I appreciate the honesty with which you spoke about certain things being a waste of time, and so on and so forth. Some of the earlier panels had such honesty and others less so. And I thought maybe we could connect some of the points you said about some of the themes that appeared in previous panels. Specifically, there's a question of trade between democracies and dictatorships, and I was interested in your perspective on imbalances regarding very specific cases. There is growing awareness, especially in the United States, I think, a grassroots movement thinking about trade in tainted resources, oil, diamonds, other such minerals from conflict-ridden areas. And it seems to me like a lot of the arguments against such reform, curtailing the kind of trade that we do with these regimes, hinge on imbalances. We can't know what will happen. We're afraid of shocks going through the system. Is it your perspective that maybe there are small cases, at least, with which we can start to sort of make a difference without shocking the system completely? Because we're not talking about stopping the trade with Saudi with a quarter of the world's oil reserves, but much smaller cases.
Okay,
Thank you.
thank you. You're almost writing his next column for him now.
Sorry.
I think it's
Sorry.
such a long question. So, Martin, maybe you can respond to all those 3 points, and then Gita, and then there'll be time for one more round of questions, please. I thought he was making advertisement for a rival newspaper by talking about The Guardian, you see. I thought that wasn't allowed here.
On the first one, I think this difference is much less significant than you think. The G7, of course, still conclude all the major reserve currencies and the major float, and they, on the whole, never intervene. It's very rare. So for them, it was a major decision, and because they are the major reserve currencies, it's big for the markets. The other G20 countries tend to intervene on their own personal account all the time. Well, it varies with the countries. They don't hold major reserve currencies, so they're not fundamentally going to affect the yen value, with the exception of China, and China pursues its own policy. So I don't think that's significant. As significant as you think. The G20, this is to take a very long time to say, but the G20 was a very significant body during the crisis, and the shift to the G20 is, I think, a very important symbolic event, despite the fact that it's pretty unwieldy. The second point, investment. Is investment shifting? I think that was the question here. That's a really long story, but I think the short answer to that, at least as far as the developed world is concerned, is no. And the main reason for that is that the dominant story on investment in the developed world during the crisis, and it remains the case today, is that it's fallen. That it's just, there isn't much. It's not that there isn't any, it's beginning to pick up now at last, but it's very lagged effect of the crisis. It lasts a long time. Most Western non-financial corporates are sitting on fantastically large piles of cash, and it will be very interesting to see where they invest. I am reasonably sure that the sort of pattern of investment we saw before the crisis in shopping malls and all that stuff will not recur. But how dramatically different will be from the past, it will be fascinating to see. In the developing world, the emerging world, the pattern shift is clearly ongoing, very interesting, but I think it's just part of the development process. Trade. I'm one of the people who tend to think that using trade as a political weapon is quite difficult and dangerous and usually unsuccessful. There's been a long-term policy in the West to try and promote trade with most countries, there are obviously exceptions, in the view that that will support development, growth, create a middle class, and in the long run lead to transformation of societies. And I believe that still, that basic logic holds. So I have, within reason, there are obviously reasons, no real problem at all with continuing to trade with governments that are very different from our own. You mentioned the specific question of resources. Well, I'm afraid as long as we have the hunger for oil that we have, we're going to go on buying oil from countries that have it.
Gita, would you like to respond to maybe just a couple of the points there?
I agree with Martin on the first question in terms of the fact that I don't think we're we can afford to be interventionist, as the G20 bloc, in the context of what happened in Japan. Clearly, because of some of the stuff I've explained earlier and some of the stuff that Martin has explained. But I want to just raise one point about the Fukushima, tragic event. I think, what we all have to be very concerned with is the disruption of the global supply chain. And that, I think, on a negative side, I think has affected adversely on businesses all around the world. But I think on a more positive note, it will precipitate a reinvesting cycle, not just in Japan, but hopefully in other parts of Asia, including China, India, and ASEAN, or the Southeast Asia. You've seen the McKenzie study just for purposes of, infrastructure development in the next decade. Asia Pacific has to, get about $7 to $8 trillion worth of investments in its infrastructure. So that, I think, will be a big boost to Asia Pacific from an investment standpoint. Now, on the second question, FDI is forecasted to grow by 20%, global FDI this year. And that number is supposed to be $1.5 trillion this year. But we all know statistically in the past many decades, good chunk of that is going still to the developed markets. At least 80% of that amount is going to the developed markets. So the non-developed market, as a beneficiary of this big $1.5 trillion will have to tinker with, whatever they can sell. And it usually boils down to the natural resource. But I think there is a bonus in recent months in that some of the more emerging countries, Indonesia, India, we can afford to sort of like climb up the value chain and create a new investment roadmap as to not just get on with the natural resource. So it's already happening in Indonesia. Indonesia's investment rose by an unprecedented level. We went up by close to 60% last year from the year before. And first quarter result was also quite staggering at 28% rise year on year. The money is coming. I'm not too worried about whether or not there's money, but I'm more worried about whether or not we can address some of the more fundamental issues such as corruption, the bureaucratic dead weight and all that. But I am quite comfortable if I take a 10 to 20 year view, and that the young, youthful population of Indonesia, I think, will take a good view of what needs to be done.
No, well, thank you very much. And I just would like to respond myself to that question about whether investments are moving into, as you say, more long-term investments. From where I sit, I see a lot of interest also by Singapore, by other states in Asia, very large assets, putting money into exactly what you've identified, Gita, as the high technology, innovative businesses here in Europe.
I just want to add, David, the UK out of nowhere became the second largest foreign investor in Indonesia. The US came out of nowhere. They were number 23 in 2009. They were number 3 last year. So I think money is moving, and it doesn't take a lot to move a country like Indonesia in terms of FDI.
I don't see a forest of hands, and I think we've had a very good discussion up here. So I'm going to just close the discussion just with one final point to our two panelists, and it is about China, and I apologize for stressing China, Gita, because you've told us that there are other countries in Asia apart from China, but China, of course, is uniquely fascinating. First of all, with you, Martin, this $3 trillion of reserves, which seems to be a bit of a mistake, do you actually see any possibility that as China slowly goes towards a consumption economy, and also, as Gita says, they do have a demographic problem, they have a pension problem, do you think that we've now seen the high point and that they're going to draw down on these reserves, also as they let the renminbi rise? I mean, I know it's always very awkward to stick your neck out, but you do it all the time, and when you're right, you remind people that you were right, and when you were wrong, people tend to forget. So here's your big chance of making a big forecast.
And when I'm wrong, they remind me. I think my forecast is we have not seen the peak. Certainly not, but the rate of increase is slowing. So I think it's very plausible that we're not going to see 6 trillion. But the China is doomed to continue to accumulate reserves for some time further. But I think it's very clear that the Chinese government has decided, very clear, that it wants to stop this process and it wants to rebalance the economy. But I agree absolutely and completely with what's said by Gita earlier, and I said earlier, this is a long-term and slow adjustment process which will probably take it up to a decade or so.
And Gita, the question for you, it's the old chestnut of whether you can actually get the alignment between the political liberalization and the market liberalization. Many people think that accidents will happen in China. They always do. What is your prediction of what sort of political system we'll have in China in 10 years?
China is on a very, very strong footing. But I go by, you know, my buddies, my lawyer and banker buddies, each of which, you know, has 7 to 10 properties in China, most of which are uninhabited. And that is exactly what I saw in Bangkok in '96, what I saw in Jakarta in '97, just before what happened. And, you know, go back to the rice bowl anecdote. You know, if you're already eating 3 bowls of rice, and if I ask you to eat 6, not easy. So I think it's going to take time, and they have to go through some kind of a correction. I don't think it's going to be by virtue of an actual supreme collapse, but you know, there has to be some corrective mode.
Well, if they're Goldman Sachs, and I believe you are connected with Goldman Sachs, they're probably still telling their clients to buy real estate when, in fact, they've put a lot of put options on all those apartments. I would imagine that is the story. So you heard it here first. Ladies and gentlemen, it's been a huge shame that we haven't had Christine Lagarde up here. I mean, I would have just been sitting here just totally mesmerized under her spell, had that been the case. It's been a great deal more boring to have just 3 gentlemen here speaking to you. I do apologize for that. At least we've had Gita here to liven it up. The other 2 of us, I used to work on the Financial Times. Martin still does. Talk about diversity, you know, can't you do better than that? But anyway, it's been very good fun discussing up here, and I do hope you've half enjoyed it as well.